Jim, I'm going to transition us here onto our final topic of the day, which we are continuing our USA at 250 segment here. So this week in 1776, the Declaration of Independence is being published and spread all throughout the colonies. The British are mustering to invade New York. But I want to take us away from the coast there, all the way in the wild, wild west, beyond the far blue mountains, into the place that will be known as Kentucky. There is a hero of the American frontier who, by the time I was in school, was barely taught anymore. Barely mentioned outside of a brief cartoon or something in elementary school of a guy in a coonskin cap. And that's a real shame because Daniel Boone is part of the American mythos. He is one of our greatest folk heroes, and he was a real person who was an adventurer and a frontiersman who people should be able to look up to today. On July 14th of 1776, his 14-year-old daughter Jemima and her friends 15-year-old Elizabeth and 13-year-old Frances were goofing off in a canoe on the Kentucky River, and they drifted outside of the area of general safety established by a new settlement their families had created called Boonesboro. While the girls were goofing off, they were snatched up by a war party of Shawnee and Cherokee Indians led by an Indian named Hanging Maw, which is like the coolest name I've ever heard, who would eventually be the chief of the Overhill Cherokee, and they were taken north. Daniel Boone and others in their camp heard the girls screaming, and when they went to investigate, found them gone and the canoe empty on the shoreline. And because Daniel Boone was, among some of his friends, one of the best trackers in the country in terms of the settlers, he knew immediately what had happened from the sign that was left on the riverbank. So this version of the account is written in a book called Blood and Treasure, which I strongly recommend people to go check out. 3 of the cabin builders joined Boone's pursuit, bringing his party to 8. By early on Monday morning, they had tracked the Indians to their previous night's encampment, but from there, the trail went cold. More specifically, several trails went cold. No longer were Betsy's heel marks acting as a beacon, and the bent and broken shrubbery seemed to be more scattered, with no more sign of the shredded handkerchief bits that the girls had been leaving behind. Boone deduced that the Indians were not only sporadically splitting up, but also deliberately laying false sign. All of the paths, in any case, led in one general direction, almost due north towards the Licking and then into Shawnee country. Boone drew his little troop together and told them that instead of running in circles, they'd be better off plowing ahead towards the Ohio. On several occasions, they recrossed, stifling the few mild protests to follow it. Boone kept his company together at a steady jog. But they did eventually catch up, so tomorrow, on June, I don't even know what date that is, not real. On July 17th, the 7 rescuers belly crawled up the rise looking over the Indian camp. One of the men fired into the camp before he got the signal to actually fire, and so everything erupted into chaos. One Shawnee, seeing that they were being attacked, tried to murder the girls with a war club, but was shot dead by Boone and another man. And the other Indians ended up scattering into the brush, and the girls were rescued miraculously, mostly unharmed. This was, multiple days that these guys were tracking a war party through the forest, not knowing how many Indians they were going to run into up the trail. They just charged right ahead to save these girls who were probably being kidnapped either for, I'll euphemistically say, marriage to other Indians or possibly for ransom. These men like Daniel Boone, they didn't have like government out there on the frontier or insurance to fall back on. They had no medical care, forget free medical care. On many occasions, Boone lost everything, and I mean everything. If your money was stolen, It was gone. Titles and deeds to land multiple times fell through for Daniel Boone, or were lost, or weren't filed properly or something, so he lost the property and he'd have to start all over again from scratch, over and over. But he, like many who, trailed after his progress into the wilderness, kept on anyway. Being taken care of entirely by the government the way that the DSA wants us to be is not part of our national character. And Chris, I'm sure you're probably a little bit horrified to hear, when I was in school, we really did not learn very much besides the name of Daniel Boone. I cannot say that if I was not interested in history outside of that, or watching, like, I think that this story is actually the inspiration for Last of the Mohicans. If I wasn't interested in our history, I would know nothing at all about Daniel Boone besides the fact that he was like a frontier guy who wore possibly a coonskin cap.
Sadly, when I was teaching in South Carolina, I know for a fact that Daniel Boone was not mentioned one time in the entire social studies standards. So technically, because I was a U.S. history teacher and I had to teach to the test, I didn't really mention him. I think I might have mentioned him in passing, but yeah, I mean, Daniel Boone, I mean, he's a legend. He's an American legend. I mean, geez, can you imagine the courage, the tenacity, the perseverance, the incredible like hardships that he must have faced, and he just kept going. I look up to people like Daniel Boone. I look up to those people who went in the rugged, wilderness and just made do. Those are the people that really did create the United States. I think that he should be celebrated as a hero, and unfortunately, he's not.
One thing I found interesting during the previous segment was Gavin Newsom, in his little statement there, he kept using the word fight. We fight. We're fighting for this. We fought for that. And he doesn't look like a guy who's been in a lot of fights, if you ask me. And it's kind of weird because he was mimicking a big moment in recent American history where a man was shot on stage, was wrestled to the ground by his own allies, the Secret Service, and then as soon as he was allowed to stand up, raised his fist and yelled, "Fight, fight, fight," to the audience. Now that's tough. That's toughness there. Sitting in I can't remember what kind of chair it was, but it looked pretty comfortable. Sitting in the comfy chair and saying, "We fight for this and we're going to fight for that." It doesn't convince. There are real serious men in our history and women who were incredibly heroic. The pioneer woman is an American character that we really need to restore.
You talking about Renee Drummond? Just kidding.
Yes, the pioneer woman was.
She's a baker, I think, or something.
Right. The pioneer woman is such a great American character and so represents this country. We baby ourselves in one another nowadays, and that's why it's so hard to get people to work. It's because we say, well, we don't want to make somebody work. You won't get a whole lot of money from the government, but you'll get enough, more than enough to keep you from having to work. So we've lost that image. And I think that this story is such a great story because you're right. It's almost certainly did inspire Fenimore Cooper's fantastic book, Last of the Mohicans. And these are people that we should really be emulating, that we should have some courage. And what you said about Daniel Boone, his life, how many times things were taken away from him. They just said, okay, let's get back up and do it. Go back to the beginning of this program today, where you had a guy whose wife was taken to jail because she earned it, as far as we know, and he's crying on social media about it. It's like, if you're a man, then go freaking storm the freaking place. So don't be a big baby. And we have lost that. And when the people who claim to represent us, the Gavin Newsoms of the world, use these big words, fight, 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 but they've clearly never been challenged in any way. And when they do get challenged, they back off always. It's sad. And it's great to see these stories. And yes, let's get these out to the children. I would ask everyone who's listening to this program to play this segment for some child you know. Let them see what kind of heroism that our country is based on, and what kind of heroism that they could emulate and that they could live up to sometime if a test should ever come. We hope it doesn't. But if it ever does, I want them emulating Daniel Boone and not the whiny baby on social media.
Yeah. Look, there's a reason they don't teach the story of Daniel Boone in school anymore, and it's on purpose. And it's because because the story of Daniel Boone is a story of American exceptionalism. There was no other country on earth at the time that was expanding its civilization across an entire massive continent. Only that was really only happening in this country, in America. And frankly, the story of Daniel Boone, in truth, is really not all that extraordinary. I mean, there's always some myth and truth put in there, but many men and families went through the same things, had to show the same courage and determination to expand our civilization from 13 colonies on the East Coast to become a continental nation and eventually a global power. So we know Daniel Boone's name, but he really is a stand-in for all of us, of all the people that expanded and did that, right? And a confident country, a healthy, confident country, creates a mythos that the people tell each other about themselves and their country. And that's why it's important that the story of Daniel Boone should be told. But it's not told in schools anymore. What stories about America do they tell in modern public schools? They tell a story of a country of slavery and racism and exploitation and empire and sexism. That is also all on purpose, because a nation confident in itself, because it is proud and knowledgeable about its past, cannot be easily conquered from either within or without. But a country that is continually, it becomes unconfident, and the people become easily molded if they are constantly fed, those things existed in our time, but that does not define who Americans are and what America is. But to the modern left that controls our public schools, it is. And they do that on purpose so that we can be, frankly, conquered from within.
For our USA at 250 segment today, I really wanted to make sure that I tied it to the main news of the show. And if you are like me and you read a lot of contemporary historical nonfiction and fiction, you will know that disease was a major threat during the Revolutionary War, as it was during pretty much every ground war ever, including today, probably. But I think the last major ones were probably World War I, World War II, and Vietnam and like Korea that had, just mostly because for the latter with, like swamp conditions and stuff. But anyway, it was swamp conditions for the Revolutionary War as well. In the 18th century, they actually did have fairly good, better than most people realize, understanding of how disease was spread, even if they didn't have a full grasp of microbiology or bacteria or viruses or anything like that. One of the most common sicknesses in camp was dysentery. If you played the Oregon Trail, you know what that is. And camp fever, which was typhus. They knew that dirty water was a major driver of these illnesses. There are tons of letters discussing as much. Most camps had strict sanitation and isolation protocols when they could enforce them, which is not always so easy, especially at the beginning of the war when volunteer fighters were coming and going all the time. About 17,000 American troops died of disease during the Revolutionary War. You know how many died from actually being killed in battle? 6,800 about. So more than 2 times as many people died of disease during the Revolutionary War on our side as were actually killed in battle. Smallpox was the deadliest and most worrisome of all the diseases that they dealt with. And Washington himself was constantly worried about it. So how back then did they handle a disease as virulent as smallpox? Inoculations, it turns out, with live virus. Getting the illness in a mild form intentionally in order to make you immune from future infection. So at first, Washington didn't want to do it because even though he knew it would work, because he had previously had smallpox and recovered from it and therefore was immune from it, doing it in their context, in the context of a camp, it's harder to control, could potentially put a lot of soldiers out of commission when they were needed. But by early 1777, he really had no choice. They were dropping like flies, really. And so this is actually what Washington did, is the first mandatory smallpox inoculation of military forces in history. This is the first time a military leader said, we are all going to become immune to this particular disease. So all troops were gradually inoculated by rotating their divisions through. And that's, the way that they did the inoculation was by an infected fluid. You can look up exactly what that fluid was on your own. I'm not going to say it. It's gross. And they would rub it into a cut that they would make on the upper arm. So after a week or so, the soldier would come down with smallpox, and then he'd be in a quarantine hospital tent. And once he recovered, he was immune for life. So fancy that. We might call this mandated herd immunity. And it worked. Shock of all shocks, the thing that we all know worked. New recruits were immediately given the inoculation procedure, and soon, while smallpox would still break out among some, the bulk of the Continental Army was immune to it and could keep fighting, but the British were still highly susceptible for it. So something that had been benefiting the British in the beginning of the war was turning on them. So I think this whole situation reminds me that, we don't give our immediate ancestors enough credit, right? Every time I read something like this, or when I read, the works of Marco Polo or something, I'm reminded that we are not smarter than them. We're really not. We have knowledge that, like book knowledge that's been built on previous generations' discoveries and stuff. But our ancestors weren't just like blindly rolling around in the mud, like the movies will kind of make you think. I mean, they didn't have modern chemical, dental hygiene or something, but they did clean their teeth with like a tooth cloth. And they knew that a rotting tooth was a danger to your health. They knew that it would make it more likely for you to suddenly die of heart attack and stuff like that. And so they would yank that sucker. It was kind of it's kind of a crazy thing to think about. Very Wild West kind of medical care that they had back then. But they did their best. They knew that quarantine worked. There was that post on X, or that account on X, 1776 Live, posted just a couple days ago that I think Boston had a mandated quarantine for people with smallpox. And what you would do is you would stay in your house. You'd put a little like red ribbon on your door frame or something to let people know that there were sick people inside, like they did during the plague. And then you would self-isolate or whatever. And I was reading about this and I thought, this is, I mean, this is identical, but the difference is that we have been convinced by our health establishments that things like herd immunity doesn't work, even though Sweden did it and it did work for them when it came to COVID. Just impressive history. I think the first ever, I don't have this data in front of me here, but I think the very first ever like official medical research center was started in the like late 1790s or something, because they started the Marine Field Hospital and research facility. So it's just, a lot of this history begins a lot further back than any of us would naturally guess.
One of the things, I studied the Revolutionary War a lot because it's just such an interesting time period, as you laid out early on in the war, before Washington really took charge and organized the army, when they were still just state militias fighting together. They didn't even build proper trenches, and they were going to the bathroom in the river water right behind their camp. So that was a huge problem. And one of the things that Washington did was he said, we need to make sure that we have order in the camp. We need to make sure that latrines are built and all that kind of stuff. And that in and of itself probably saved the Continental Army at the very early times when they could have been destroyed by the British. So thank God that Washington was there, and other people were aware of the problems of these diseases back then, and the army did not succumb to it, because we'd be living in a very different world.
Yeah, the smallpox blanket thing is a myth, but what wasn't a myth is that our troops, or like Washington, was aware that the British were attempting something like biological warfare, or they suspected that they were trying something like biological warfare, because what the British would do is they would round up a bunch of people with smallpox, like just civilians, in their cities, and they would send them in the direction of wherever the Continentals were camped, so that the Continentals would take in these like refugees that were smallpox infected and hopefully spread it in the camp, because they knew that, obviously we've known for thousands of years that disease is catching. So it wasn't far-fetched to believe that that was part of the method there. And that's part of the reason why Washington became so gung-ho for the inoculation procedure, is because it basically made those types of little tactics ineffective, because all the troops were already inoculated. That didn't mean that their camp followers and stuff weren't also getting sick, but their fighting force was able to keep it together.
And a lot of them died on those horrific prisoner ships that the British used, in which there was no inoculation, and it was really dirty and sick, and people were starving to death. And yeah, so I mean, I think sometimes we do take for granted, living in 2026, how we can just go to the pharmacy, boom, get the pill, and be okay in a couple of days. Yeah, back then they did not have antibiotics. They obviously didn't have any of the medications, most of the medications that we have today. So I mean, I am forever grateful that all these medical breakthroughs have been made, and that generally speaking, we don't have to deal with some of the horrors that they did, a couple hundred years ago.
Jim, you're muted. Jim, you are muted.
Sorry, I did it again. I had to be muted because I'm having some audio issues here on this different setup. But I doubt that General Washington was determined to throw out of the Continental Army anybody who did not get inoculated for smallpox, which was actually the policy.
Oh, that's funny.
Under Biden and all that. So, but yeah, you're right. I mean, I love our USA at 250 segment at the end of each of these podcasts, and I'm sure our audience does as well. We learn something new every week, thanks to you, Linnea. And it is really one thing that you stated, something that I always think of as we go through these segments, is that we do have this arrogance in modern times because we have so much technology and so many advancements in medicine. And like you said, we have book knowledge. We're standing on the shoulders of giants, as the cliche goes. But the irony is that as technology advances, like AI and stuff, humans are actually going to get dumber than we were 250 years ago, because we don't have we don't need the discipline that they had to learn what they needed to learn to advance society.
Oh, so I am going to transition us into our America at 250, or USA at 250. I still don't know what the segment is called. Segment here to close us out. This week in 1776 continues much of the same as the last couple of weeks. More ships are appearing off of the coast of New York. It seems that the entire British Navy has showed up. You can imagine the horizon just speckled with white sheets from tall ships. They're moving up the rivers too, and they're landing ground troops to try to surround the city. Meanwhile, in Pennsylvania, the very first state constitution is being drafted, and it's almost complete. And this one that's being drafted right now will be the state constitution until 1790, when they look at what it wrought and decide to throw it away because it was kind of garbage. And so the very first version of it is a look at what our federal government might have looked like if we had followed this example too closely, and if we leaned a little bit too hard towards popular democracy and the kind of like hyper enlightenment democratic principles, which it turned out are not so great. So it was influenced very heavily by the ideas of Thomas Paine and Benjamin Franklin, who continued to defend it even after it started falling apart. So there's that. It had several unique features. One, it had a unicameral legislature, like Nebraska has now, but a lot bit worse. So that means that it had a single house. Our government has, to the people who aren't familiar with these terms, our government has what's called a bicameral legislature. So we have the House and the Senate, bicameral. The idea was, though, for the Pennsylvania Constitution, that no one should be able to overrule elected representatives. Franklin really liked this, as I said, and you'll see why we should all be thankful that some of his more conservative colleagues ended up getting a bit of moderation on that for our federal government. Instead of having a governor, Pennsylvania established a Supreme Executive Council, so a committee, yay. And the president of that council had basically no real authority. It also had the widest voter pool of all. What's happening? It also had the widest voter pool of any other state's election system. It granted suffrage to any free man 21 or older with 1 year of residence and paid taxes. At the time, this was very radical. Obviously, today that sounds restrictive compared to what we have now. But then it was very radical. Other states at least demanded some kind of property ownership. Representatives also only served for 1 year. Which, can we turn off the music, please? Sorry, I can't hear myself think over it. Representatives only served for 1 year, which might sound good to those of us who get frustrated with our representatives and think like, this person has been in the Senate for decades. When are they leaving? But it actually bore out a lot of instability. They were also unpaid, which again sounds really good to me when I'm mad at our own feckless and greedy legislators. But think about it a little bit more why that might not be the best idea. They also had a council of censors, which every 7 years was supposed to act as a sort of combination of a Supreme Court and Continental Congress or Constitutional Congress. And they would look at whether or not the Constitution was being violated in some way and what changes need to be made to that Constitution. So every 7 years they were rewriting everything, or that was the plan anyway. And they thought that would eliminate the threat of like totalitarian government. And that council was also elected with direct popular vote, as were the judiciary. John Adams, who Sam referenced earlier in the show, famously hated it. His quote is great on it. He called it so democratical that it must produce confusion and every evil work. He thought it was volatile and prone to swinging wildly with the whims of the voters. And it did. It turns out, for one, that having unpaid representatives, while that sounds good to us when we're angry at them, meant that only the people who could afford to not have a real job could hold office. So people who needed to work for a living couldn't take a year off to serve and to do it. The 1776 Constitution was basically all power to the legislature. So imagine there's no Senate, just the House, just Congress. And they have all of the power with no checks and balances. Even the judiciary was subject to their whims, and there was no counterbalance to that. Judges could be removed at a whim for alleged misbehavior, which was determined by the legislature. Multiple justices were removed for ruling in ways that were just unpopular or for questioning the fiscal policy of the legislature. There were no checks. That ended up happening. Or what ended up happening was they just issued endless currency to pay for the things that were popular in their districts, including war financing, paying off state debt. Soldiers were paid in currency then during those years that they were like spending like crazy. That was worth basically nothing because they just printed tons and tons of currency. They were impotent to act quickly when conditions demanded. For example, in 1763, there was a mutiny that was marching on Philadelphia because soldiers weren't being paid. And the Supreme Executive Council couldn't address the mutineers' demands because they weren't allowed to do anything without the full assembly being there. And the full assembly couldn't be there because there were mutineers gathering outside of the State House. So they couldn't defend themselves. And the Continental Congress had to flee and leave the town because it couldn't get defense approval as a mob is literally descending on them. Ironically, the most democratic constitution in the country actually ended up being the most unstable and the most impotent and the most tyrannical. because short-term thinking dominated all of their decisions. The legislature repeatedly passed rulings based on what would just get people to leave them alone and be happy for a bit, rather than thinking about the long-term consequences. So everything that's bad about what we have now, all the bad impulses of our Congress were hyperinflated by this system. There was so little trust because turnover was half of the Congress every year. So people would be owed money by the government, and they would be promised it by one Congress 1 month, and then an almost entirely new government would deny them payment a few months later. This did not work at all. And so in 1790, they moved to a bicameral legislature with a governor and checks and balances, like pretty much everyone else ended up going towards. But I wanted to highlight this story, even though it takes place over several years and not necessarily just this week in 1776, because it was like the first really early experiment with a state level government being formed, where they attempted the perfect popular democracy model, where they had super short term limits. Everything was based on, they hoped that it would make it so that the people's position was always being represented by their government, and that it couldn't be overruled by a governor vetoing some kind of legislation that was being passed, because Thomas Paine and Benjamin Franklin and the people who drafted that original government thought that was tyranny to have a governor that could veto the popular legislature. It turned out that was not the case. And we see these kinds of government frameworks being proposed by organizations like the DSA, although theirs is obviously more extreme to communism rather than just strict democracy. But I thought that this was great. Imagine, the volatility of your voter base, being led nowadays by the whims of social media or media in general, and having every single year all of your legislators are being overturned with new ones, which means every single year whatever is popular is the new thing that your entire government is being run on. It's just insane.
Talk about your laboratories of democracy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
What they didn't have a lot of experience with true democracy. And so they tried it, and they found out that the tyranny of the majority is as bad as, and in some ways worse than the tyranny of the average king. And the reason is exactly as you mentioned there, that you can go from one extreme idea to another within weeks or months. And there's no consistency, and there's no protection from it. The way our system works is by giving a lot of different institutions authority to veto what's going on. So the president can veto a bill. Then the Congress can veto what the president did by overriding his veto. And the Supreme Court can say, well, you can't enforce this particular statute because the Constitution doesn't allow it. And then the president can say, I'm not going to enforce that statute because the Constitution doesn't allow it. Or states could say, we're not going to follow that law because the Constitution doesn't allow it. And then the president can say, well, we're going to make you follow the law because we're going to take away a lot of money, or we're actually going to come marching in there as they did after the firing on Fort Sumter. So that is the way a good Republican system works, is that everybody gets veto power. And the 9th and 10th Amendments of the Constitution are critical to that, where they put all power that is not explicitly granted in the Constitution to the federal government. They give all that power to the states and the people explicitly. And so what you had in Pennsylvania was a very good experiment that taught us a very useful lesson.
Yeah, I mean, exactly right. I'm typing in my little notes here. It's like America was an experiment, especially in the early years before we were even a country. New England had its own distinct flavor of self-governance, very, very local. Southern states had their own flavor. Pennsylvania obviously had theirs. There were different communities in each of these states. Maryland's had a lot of Catholics. Pennsylvania had Quakers and Germans. But, it's interesting that, yeah, that Constitution, that first stab at the Constitution, nice try. It really wasn't, it was quite unworkable, obviously. And as we see, obviously, in the evolution of the United States, is that most states ended up basically copying the federal Constitution in structuring their own state governments. But, instead of that extreme diffusion of power, and as you described, kind of the chaos that it would generate and did generate, Madison and the other framers of the Constitution, they were geniuses, and they went for a balance of power instead of, a diffusion of power. There's a slight difference to that. So power is balanced between two legislatures, and then also among three co-equal branches of the Congress, the President, and the Supreme Court. And you think of, I mean, it was the age of the Enlightenment. These people were the greatest thinkers of the age, and they just happened to be residents of a colony instead of one of the old world countries. And so they had the opportunity to put some of these very bold, radical, revolutionary ideas of freedom and liberty and how to preserve it. That's something that I love this segment, Linnea. I love your dedication to this, because it reminds us on a weekly basis of what the goals of the founding fathers were and the founding generation was. And it was to establish a society and a government that would not infringe on the liberty of the people. And that itself was just a radical idea. And so I love these lessons, because I'd never really been cognizant of the fact that there were some tries that were pretty bad, but the intent was there, and you keep trying, and eventually they did create a government and a society in which the freedom and liberty of individual free people was paramount, and the government's role was to make sure that was protected and to never infringe. Although I will say there are two things about the Pennsylvania plan that I did like. 21 years old to vote. 21 years old in the 18th century is a lot older than 21 years old now, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And you also have to live there for a year. You had to be a taxpayer or the son of a taxpayer to vote. That's a pretty good idea, because you have a stake. I've said this before. I got in trouble. Some lefty, I think, clipped me, and that I don't want, I want to disenfranchise everybody. No. I just said, if you have a stake in the game because you pay taxes, yeah, I think that's a pretty good. We should think about it, as that's who gets to vote, not people who don't have a stake in the game. And also that all free men and their sons shall be trained and armed to defend the Commonwealth from the enemies of liberty. Yeah, I love it. Shall be trained and armed. You don't get a choice in it. We all need to be in this together to protect our liberty. I like it.
Yeah, I did
very much like that it held that you couldn't be in the legislature more than 4 out of any 7 years. I thought that was a really good way of doing things, because with term limits, it is reasonable to say, look, some of these people, they do have experience in writing laws and so forth, and you don't want to lose that, but get them out of there for a while so that when they come back, they've had some experience in the real world. Of course, nowadays their experience is lobbying in the meantime. So.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm gonna cut us off here. Although I have to say I do like the wording. I think in the Pennsylvania version of the Second Amendment was probably better than what we ended up going with, just because it was more explicit. But the one we ended up going with has more artful quality. Although it has led to some weasel words. Not that they wouldn't find ways to weasel around it nowadays anyway, but whatever. Because I want to get into our USA at 250 concepts here in the last 7 minutes of our show or so. But I'm really glad that we got to talk over the Medicare issue and also the big tech issue, because those are things that are important and they're going to keep coming up. And one of these days we'll get Donald back in here to talk about AI because that's been heating up even more.
You sure about that?
If he's not too busy to come on our show. So we'll do that. But I want to talk briefly about 1776 for a minute here. But the last 2 weeks of 1776, since we didn't have the show last week, was not, I mean, there's a lot going on, but it's much like the last few weeks where there's a lot going on involved in preparing for the pending attack on New York City by the British, and the dissemination of the Declaration, which was officially signed by the rest of the delegates the first week of August. So this week, though, the Declaration actually reached London, and it was not largely received very well. There was pretty staggering amounts of misinformation and censorship. Some London newspapers censored all of the times in the Declaration that King George was named specifically and directly accused of misconduct. They would put in his place either a generalized term like the British or something like that, or they or something like that, or even just a dash to just censor out the name, because they thought it would really upset people if they found out that that King George's conduct specifically was the cause of this revolution. So there's a book that came out this spring about the news coverage of the Declaration called When the Declaration of Independence Was News by Emily Sneff. Reason.com covered it, and I'm going to read a little bit from their coverage. They wrote, several London newspapers assumed that the Declaration of Independence itself was an absurd and nefarious plot planned in France or Spain. So guys, this stuff, the conspiracy stuff is absolutely not new. The more you read in history, the more you realize that absolutely nothing changes ever, and that we are exactly the same people as lived 250 years ago. So the Gazetteer and the New Daily Advertiser reported that when the Congress resolved upon independence, there were present several foreigners of different nations, amongst whom were some persons of distinction from the courts of Versailles and Madrid. It also fantasized that as soon as the colonies declared themselves independent states, 2 foreign vessels, which were at Philadelphia, slipped their cables and sailed with intelligence to the above courts. The Morning Chronicle claims that the Continental Congress President John Hancock had been duped by the arch-rebel and crafty pettifogger Samuel Adams. Other London newspapers disputed the specified grievances in the Declaration. In a reply to the Declaration of the Representatives of the Disunited States in America in Congress Assembled, published in the Morning Post by someone under a pseudonym, argued, in Sneff's words, that the British colonists were a people who were made to be subdued. They had no sovereignty or authority, and they had turned against the king whose character was great and merciful and not tyrannical. So yeah, crafty pettifogger is a great term. So after hearing a little bit about this particular essay, I thought, well, surely this is online somewhere because everything is online now. And it is. And I read it, and it's a novella length essay. I have no idea how they were publishing these things in the newspapers. I think probably it was like a pamphlet rather than a newspaper article because, well, for one, it's positively dripping with contempt. And it addresses one by one every major claim of the Declaration. And it is a fascinating read. It reads a lot like what you'll find if you hit the expand button on X or something, and someone has gone on Facebook or on X or on social media somewhere and responded to someone's argument sentence by sentence. It's amazing. So I want to read a little bit about it because it's quite funny, actually. So to Article 4 of the Declaration, which complained that the king called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of their public records for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. This is what the pseudonymous author of the novella length essay seethes. This is what he writes in reaction to Article 4. There is something so truly ridiculous in this article that it is hardly possible to answer it with any becoming gravity. At first blush, it looks as if it was inserted by an enemy, as if intended to throw an air of ridicule on the Declaration in general, among reasons to justify a national revolt, and to find it gravely alleged that the members of an assembly happened once upon a time to be straitened in their apartments and compelled to sit on strange seats and to sleep in strange beds is, I believe, unexampled in the history of mankind. Sickly and feeble must be the constitution of the patriotism which these hardships, dreadful as they are, could fatigue into a compliance with unpatriotic measures. All right, so as you can see, there's not a whole lot of empathy overseas there. I love it. I love this glimpse into the perspectives of our disconnected opponents abroad. And so I'll read the title of the essay again. It's called "A Reply to the Declaration of the Representatives of the Disunited States in America." Fascinating stuff. Don't use Brave to look for it, because for some reason Brave can't find it. Unfortunately, Google is the one that you have to use. Google Chrome is the one that you have to. No, God! Yeah, for some reason, Brave wants to give you like modern day political articles, even if you put search modifiers around it, which is a complaint of mine about modern web browsers for another show. But yeah, so guys, I just, it's so fascinating to me how little things change.
When you said that comment, that just made me think that even back in the late 1700s, there was a lot of political animosity and a lot of mudslinging, and there were duels. So when we talk about, oh my gosh, did you see what senator said about that, or representative said about that? It's like, do you know that they were actually take pistols and go and kill each other like a couple hundred years ago? So I always just, it's just a funny little thing, but.
I just love this guy who wrote, whoever it is that wrote this article or this essay, is completely disconnected. Like, he doesn't know what's going on in the colonies necessarily. I mean, I imagine he's probably a member of parliament or something, not sure. But, he's saying that the complaint from the colonists that the king would, have our legislative bodies meet like far away from where they're actually from and stuff, and fatiguing them into compliance or whatever. That certainly was something that was going on that the colonists felt was unfair. And to this guy who is across the ocean, who knows if he's even set foot in the colonies before, reading this from his perspective, this is a major complaint, the fourth complaint in the Declaration. Him taking this as like evidence that we're a bunch of whiners is really funny to me, because I can see where he's coming from on that, considering he has no concept whatsoever of what's going on in the colonies and the distances that we're talking about compared to England itself. It's amazing stuff.
Well, it just goes to show that fake news was also around 250 years ago. I didn't know CNN was that historic. Wow.
Yeah.
It reminds me of the guys that go around like in random cities and they just start creating issues with people, and then when they get confronted by the police, they just start, I'm a law scholar, and they don't know what they're talking about, but they're so convinced like they have the knowledge to talk on these topics and get out of it.
I strongly recommend this essay. Because it's, for one, from our perspective as Americans, it's not a perspective that we hear about when it comes to our history, and it is very enlightening to see, like, through the lens of someone else, someone part of the empire proper, who thought that it was all ridiculous and that our complaints were petty and silly. It's cool. It's quite crazy. And that's not the only thing he has to say about that. He goes into like wall of text explanations as to why everything the king did was necessary or reasonable or whatever. And it's quite fascinating. I guess that's the music telling me that we're gonna stop. Are you sure, Sam, that you don't have anything to say about newspaper coverage in 1776?
Oh, actually, I do. I'll be as brief as possible. But I do think it's interesting that people are always people. They're always human. They look at things from their own perspective and will defend their beliefs to the ends of the earth. That somehow, because I have this premise that the king is right, everything is going to affirm that. And so you have your wonderful confirmation bias and build an enormous argument based on that. Things never change. It's always been that way. It's probably always going to be that way. And it's a good lesson to us to look back at history and recognize that there is such a thing as human nature. There are elements of the human condition that are immutable. And we need to acknowledge them and respect them if we're going to have any success in the world, either in individual terms or in policy terms.